is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
China's Communist Party commenced its 19th National Congress on Wednesday, a key gathering held every 5 years. More than 2,300 delegates are meeting in Beijing to plan the next stage of China's development, a stage that President Xi Jinping has called an era of building on past successes. And although Africa is just a bystander in this event, many plans and policies that President Xi and his team have put in place may very well affect the continent's future. So as China continues to reform its own domestic economy, as well as its place in the world's political, economic and cultural space, what spillover effect is Africa likely to benefit from? And how prominently is Africa likely to feature on the agenda of the 19th CPC National Congress? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. The 19th National Congress of the Communist Party of China opened in Beijing on Wednesday. The CPC National Congress has been held every 5 years since 1921. Now, the Congress will review the party's achievements over the past 5 years and set the blueprint for the next 5 years of China's development. Delegates will discuss the amendment of the party constitution and elect a new CPC Central Committee and a new Central Commission for Discipline Inspection. The Congress is held at a critical time for the development of socialism with Chinese characteristics. The expectations of the people and new requirements for the development of the country and the party will also be taken into account. Now, at the opening of the Congress on Wednesday, President Xi Jinping, as the party's General Secretary, delivered the political report where he gave his thoughts on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. Xi Jinping also says the CPC will deepen reforms and accomplish its two centenary goals: a well-off society by 2020 and the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by 2049, when the country marks the centennial. CGTN correspondent Han Bin filed this report from the Great Hall of the People.
Entering a new stage of global influence. This could be a milestone for the Communist Party of China, as the theory of its top leader's concept of the Chinese dream for the great rejuvenation of the nation is laid out. In his report, General Secretary Xi Jinping tells the world the party's aims and how the targets can be achieved.
This is our strategic vision for developing socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era. Finish building a moderately prosperous society in all respects, proceed to basically realize modernization, and then move on to turn China into a great modern socialist country in every dimension. We must work with resolve and tenacity and write a brilliant chapter on our new journey to socialist modernization.
Past decades of reforms have focused on resolving domestic problems. Xi's reforms have also focused on how China deals with the rest of the world. Many say he's taken a pragmatic approach to respond to changes. He promotes globalization to create what he calls a win-win situation for all. China's economy has maintained steady growth despite the global slowdown. The Belt and Road Initiative and a more active role in matters like UN peacekeeping and climate change, along with Xi's concept of building a global community of common destiny, have helped put the country in a rising position. Xi understands the party's real threat comes from within.
We have tightened political discipline and rules to ensure that political responsibility for governance of the party is fulfilled at each level of the party organization.
The report touches on a dozen areas to work on: further reforms, transformation to an innovative society, improving people's well-being, and strengthening party building. The Party Congress, which comes every 5 years, is regarded as the country's most important political meeting. The new leadership lineup and amendments to the party's charter could bring changes to a wide spectrum of policies.
Xi Jinping's report is a theoretical expression and guiding directions of China's path. The message is clear: China has the confidence about its own solutions, which are coming from inside and work for the best interest of its own development. The policies to be endorsed could bring about profound transformation to the Chinese society as well as the world beyond. Han Bin, CGTN, at the Great Hall of the People.
Now, African leaders will also be keenly following progress at the CPC National Congress. Let's take a listen to what some of them had to say.
China has achieved great achievements that attracted the whole world. Most of its people have come out of poverty. Infrastructure of roads, railways and so on has been established in most of the country. Although China faces some problems, like in the development process and especially in corruption, one of the most famous sayings by President Xi Jinping is that the tiger should be placed in the cage of the system, which will benefit the majority of the people and not the minority. I think that the anti-corruption movement is crucial. It's a new economic revolution which will take more people out of poverty.
China's development and success has been achieved under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, and that is why we are hopeful that China will continue to play a significant and major role on the international stage.
We as the ANC certainly would observe it very closely. I know as we speak the ANC has a senior delegation that will attend this very important conference. I think it's important for us in Africa because China is an important ally, important trading partner, but more importantly a fellow political party that we share a lot of and exchange bilaterals with.
China has managed to evolve and implement its own type of democracy. And it's working. China has privileged socio-economic and cultural rights. That is why China has addressed poverty in a big way compared to many other nations around the world.
We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, we'll have more insights into the 19th CPC National Congress. Stay with us.
This is CGTN.
You're watching CGTN. I'm Jeff Moody, live in Beijing.
You're watching CGTN.
Coming to you from Washington, D.C.
You're watching CGTN.
Coming to you from my room.
I'm members of business of
Mark, what can you tell us about events happening there?
Politics
this is a pretty picture.
$100
Timing of the event.
Second time back over to Beijing.
To go after
It is all about the dance.
This is CGTN. CGTN. See the difference.
This new area will be an area of building on past successes to further advance our cause and of continuing in a new historical context to strive for the success of socialism with Chinese characteristics. It will be an area of securing a decisive victory and building a moderately prosperous society in all respects and of moving on to all-out efforts to build a great modern socialist country.
That was Chinese President Xi Jinping speaking on the new era China has entered during the opening session of the 19th CPC Congress on Wednesday. Welcome back to Talk Africa. And now to offer further insights into the Congress and its relevance to the African continent, I have expert guests standing by in Beijing, Professor Liu Bocheng. He's the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. In Johannesburg, Dr. Cobus van Steeden. He's a senior lecturer in the School of Literature, Language and Media at the University of Witwatersrand. And with me in Nairobi, Professor Peter Kagwanja. He's the President and Chief Executive of the Africa Policy Institute. Thank you for joining us on the program. Professor Liu, I'll start off with you in Beijing. The 19th National Congress of the Communist Party of China is taking place this week. First of all, for the benefit of our audience, what is the significance of the National Congress?
Well, people understand that Chinese Communist Party is the only ruling party in China. And every 5 years, they have the milestone conference to decide on the major blueprint that China should be able to go forward. So that's a roadmap set forth for all stakeholders involved in China so that they are able to see what is lying ahead. And based on the summary of the experiences and lessons over the past 5 years, so it's there to review the mission and renew the task lying ahead for China to strive.
Right.
So therefore, it is really there to have a very strong historical meaning for this whole nation.
So looking back over the last 5 years, Professor Liu, though, what's been the development model, the policy agenda that took place over the last 5 years? And do you expect a shift over the next 5 years, or is it likely to remain the same?
Well, over the last 5 years, a lot has been achieved in social and economic development, and we are going to see a continuation of the leadership and also the continuation of those policy, although we are also moving ahead with more deepened reform domestically and further opening Chinese door for global trade and investment. And in the meantime, China is ready to bear more responsibility to the global community. As President Xi Jinping mentioned, that China's store will not be shut down. And also China will strive to foster a community of common destiny for the entire human race. So that's very visionary and also aspirational to the whole world.
Professor Kagwanja, though, you're watching from Africa, and Professor Liu has talked about matters of global trade and matters of greater responsibility, though, for China. Given that China is now Africa's leading trade partner, given that there's a lot of investment and development assistance from China to Africa, why should Africa be paying attention? How much is Africa paying attention to the Congress?
I think those of us in Africa are watching keenly and listening to the policies being propounded there, because they have implications for Africa at two levels. Level one, that China has emerged as one of the major superpowers and pillars of global stability. And therefore, it is important to understand the policies that China is beginning to adopt for the remaining part of the 21st century, in order to gauge as to whether China will advance the stability of global order or there is going to be dissonance. My initial understanding is that from the concepts and words that are coming out, China is going to be a stabilizing force. At the African level, China has actually invested heavily in Africa in terms of development, in terms of opening our markets, to the point that the African continent as a whole is beginning to base its hope for progress in China. China is offering examples, for example, of how to pull our people from poverty to wealth and prosperity.
And we're going to look at that question of poverty and prosperity in a minute, because President Xi has talked about that in his speech. But Dr. Van Steeden, let me rope you in at this point, because you must have expectations, or you're looking at the Congress with expectations for Africa. What's your thinking?
It looks like China's role in Africa is going to widen over the next while. You know, in the past, China was mostly focused on trade and investment, but increasingly it's also becoming focused on peacekeeping in Africa. There's a lot of Chinese doctors, for example, doing work in Africa. So I think over the next while, what we're going to see is that China will deepen its commercial engagement with Africa, but at the same time try to widen the number of fields in which it's active in Africa.
Right. Professor Liu, several issues are coming out of here, and Professor Kagwanja talked about poverty eradication, two issues that President Xi Jinping has talked about, and one of them has been building a moderately prosperous society by eradicating poverty, as well as developing China. So when you look at the issue of poverty, though, what is the roadmap towards eradicating poverty?
Well, in the first place, the whole nation has to be fully engaged in this grand efforts. It's not a task that among a small number of social elites who are really talking about too many rhetorics, but without really going into practice. And the other is really to continue the reform so that the government will be able to support and enable the people in all walks of life to work hard. And third, that you are willing to learn, to summarize experiences learned, and also to apply new theories and new innovative models to the poverty alleviation process. And then, to borrow experience from the whole world. For example, to introduce internet technologies, to provide the training program for the local people, and then lastly, I think very importantly is the infrastructure building. So the Chinese government has done a great deal to build the infrastructure, and we have a saying that when you really wanted to get rich, you got to build the road first. So to connect people more closely and more frequently, that really generates more of productivity in the society.
Professor Kagwanja, your take there, because you did mention that Africa is struggling with its poverty eradication progress.
Yes, and I think the model that has emerged from the Africa-China cooperation is that China is investing in projects that seem to have multiplier effect. Infrastructure, industrialization, which do not only open the economy, but create employment for a large number of people than if you intervened in one sector. So I think that's one of the models that one would encourage to go on. The other bit that we want to emphasize is that China has taken the ideology or idea of developmental peace, and it came out very strongly in the speech from Xi Jinping. And I love the concept of developmental peace, because peace among poor people is not sustainable. And therefore, China's emphasis on development as an instrument of bringing holistic peace on the continent is really welcome.
Right. Dr. Van Staden, of course, there are issues that you feel that Africa could learn from China's example. Development policies, strategies, issues of corruption particularly are being looked at closely from China's perspective. What's your take?
Definitely there's been a big crackdown on corruption during President Xi Jinping's reign so far. That seems to continue, and I think Africa could probably learn a lot from that process. At the same time, I think China has focused a lot of its development on uplifting working class people. And I think Africa could also learn a lot about development from that, especially the kind of mechanisms that China follow to make it easier for working class people to make a living. I think in a lot of cases in Africa, it's unnecessarily difficult for working class people to sell things or to get around or to have power or internet access. And I think in that sense, the Chinese example could be very useful in Africa.
Right. Professor Kagwanja here, when it comes though to China and Africa's partnership now, and when it comes to formulating the policies for the next 5 years, where are we in terms of China-Africa partnerships?
I think looking at that, China is pretty much ahead in terms of conceptualizing how it needs to deal with Africa. For example, how it tackles Africa at the continental level and at the country level. So China is clear. The problem we have is with Africa, because Africa has not defined its policy towards China. It's largely ad hoc, uncoordinated, and largely not thought through. And therefore, I think we would urge the African leadership to begin focusing on very concrete issues of engagement with China so that this partnership become mutually beneficial. Otherwise, they are going to begin complaining that China is doing this, China is doing this. China has clarified its policy. Can Africa clarify its policy?
Right. Dr. Liu, in terms of the Congress itself, though, how much of a priority or a focus will be put to matters in Africa? Because President Xi has talked about matters of the developing world. How much of this will be a focus on Africa?
Well, China continue to uphold its policy of non-intervention, but in the same time to support sincerely the developing nations. Particularly, Africa is included in the core component in the Chinese global strategy and also in further integration of the global order. And right now, China shall step up its a further opening for trade and investment, but also to move to accelerate the pace of foreign aid and particularly cater to the infrastructure development and human capacity building in Africa. So China presents itself as a sincere partner that is they're placing emphasis on inclusiveness and on mutual benefit. So this is the image that China is going to present to Africa. So through the infrastructure, then to the manufacture, and then to help the economy to grow more in complement with the Chinese growth strategy.
Right. Dr. Van Staden, though, trade and investment particularly is what Africa has been looking at. And in terms of further opening up of China, though, and opening up in terms of access to markets, though, how do you see Africa taking advantage of that access to Chinese markets?
Increasingly, we're seeing a situation where Chinese companies are offshoring some of their manufacturing and assembly. So in that sense, the extension of the activities of Chinese companies to Africa is also, you know, opening up a kind of a counterflow back to China from Africa. At the same time, I think it then becomes incumbent on Africa to produce things that China needs. In order Africa should move ahead with beneficiation of its raw resources in a way that would make it feasible to export to China, and also move ahead with focusing on agricultural exports, which there are some agricultural exports already happening from Africa, but there could be a lot more. So I think it's actually the challenges for Africa to try and find niches within the Chinese economy where it can shine. You know, because China is a very big market, a very attractive market, and I think Africa should focus on that.
All right. Do you see Africa focusing on that?
Yes, I think Africa is now looking to China for technology and support for industrialization, particularly capital, in order to do what Dr. Van Staden has said, that we need to add value to our commodities so that by the time they reach the market, they have value addition. And that is the only way of pulling Africa out of poverty, by ensuring that our agricultural products are not raw materials, but are finished goods that are needed in the market. And I think it's upon China to begin to help a younger brother to open avenues for African goods in the market. The African counterparts are doing already that by prioritizing China's investment in areas of, industrialization, in areas of infrastructure, in areas of the building industry, and so on. So we would think that following the forum in South Africa, we need to move forward and now explore how do we deepen the levels of industrialization and the level of engagement at the enterprise level.
Right, Professor Kagwanja, of course, you've talked about the South African FOCAC meeting, and coming up next as well, next year, the FOCAC meeting. So looking forward, though, and looking forward into China's next 5 years, how do you see Africa featuring? How do you see the spillovers of what China is doing? How do you see Africa benefiting from that?
I think China seems to be diversifying its engagement in Africa, but it is not losing the focus on development. That's why fronted the notion of developmental peace. The notion of developmental peace is that you can also not have development in a situation of instability. Therefore, China will have to prioritize issues of security, humanitarian intervention where needed, like to deal with Ebola and other issues. More and more engagement in at diplomatic level with Africa because of Africa's voice in the United Nations. Africa constitutes about a third of the United Nations.
Right.
And so that diversification is very important, but still keeping an eye on the real ball, and the ball is development in order to lift people's lives from poverty.
All right, Dr. Van Staden, your voice?
I agree. I also think that China's role is going to become a lot more complicated. China now has a military base in Africa, so it's increasingly engaged in peacekeeping in Africa. So I think China's going to come up to more complicated choices within Africa, but at the same time I think there's a lot more opportunity now. The opportunities are particularly within the scheme of the Belt and Road Initiative, which opens up a whole set of new possibilities for East Africa particularly. And within those possibilities, China I think also has the opportunity to expand its activities in Africa and to find new spaces where China and Africa can work together fruitfully.
Right. Professor Liu, you have the final word.
Yeah, I think the further integration into the Belt and Road program is the right roadmap for most of the African countries to join in the common destiny for prosperity and also for respect and the peace. So therefore, to join the production value chain by producing more added value products to export to China, and also to have more processing capacity on the China's exports to Africa would be the way to lift the people's living standard. And finally, the education is also very important to develop the human capacity. So particularly in terms of the primary literacy. So that's something that China's experience can be lent on.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for insights. We'll leave it there for now, and that's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests for their insights. In Beijing, Professor Liu Boacheng, he's the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. In Johannesburg, Dr. Cobus Van Staden, a senior lecturer in the School of Literature, Language and Media at the University of Witwatersrand. And with me in Nairobi, Professor Peter Kagwanja, President and Chief Executive of the Africa Policy Institute. Thank you for joining us on the program. And remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And do tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall. Bye-bye.